How much did you inherit? Simon's question came out of nowhere, catching me off guard on the night of my father's funeral. I was still reeling from my grief when he asked, I heard your father had an inheritance of $3 million. So once again, how much did you get? The inquiry gave me an unsettling feeling. Distraught and desperate to avoid further tension, I lied. Nothing. I didn't inherit anything. It seems my sister and mother are the ones who received it. Simon's face lit up with a triumphant grin. I knew it. Your parents always said you were incompetent and that they didn't care about you. I'm glad my instincts were right. What? I could barely process his words. I want a divorce, he declared coldly. I can't be with someone who's poor now. I've already found someone else. I need you out of my life. With that, Simon had me sign the divorce papers. His family mocked me for my misery, but they were mistaken. They could never understand how relieved I felt to be rid of Simon's betrayal. My name is Jane. I come from a family of 4 with a younger sister named Kim. From a young age, Kim and I never got along. My mother, Anne, always sided with Kim, leaving me feeling isolated, though I eventually became accustomed to it. My father, Dan, was the only one who seemed to care, but his demanding job kept him away from home, leaving me alone with my feelings of abandonment. Even as an adult, my situation remained unchanged. I wasn't allowed to attend college due to tuition fees. Yet, when Kim was set to enroll in a private college, my mother insisted that it would be a waste not to send her despite my own lack of educational opportunities. Jane, you're not sharp or smart like Kim. It's only right that you support her education and contribute to the household. It's what any responsible older sister would do, my mother said, as if it were common sense. Her words stung deeply, and tears streamed down my face. Kim looked at me with disdain, adding, It's your own fault, you're incompetent. You're uglier and less successful than me, so you should try harder. If you can't do that, you're worthless. The toxicity of my family environment drove me to leave home once I started working. Living alone wasn't difficult for me. It felt liberating. Initially, my father sent me a small amount of money to help out, but after 6 months, that stopped. Instead, I received a letter from my mother accusing me of theft. Your father was sending you money without our permission. You have no right to it because you haven't contributed to Kim's tuition or supported us. I'll be sending you an invoice for the total amount you received. Make sure to refund it. Stop being a thief. My mother's resentment was clear, and she sent an invoice calculated to cover the exact amount of alimony, demanding repayment for the money I had received from my father. I was deeply uncomfortable discussing or debating the matter any further, so I complied with my mother's demands, sent the money, and quietly moved to a new apartment. A few years later, I married Simon, whom I met at work. Determined to sever ties with my past, I decided to inform my parents about my marriage. When I returned to their house, I was struck by how much my father had aged. The once industrious man now looked frail and bent, struggling even to stand. Oh, you're back, my mother remarked with disdain. I wonder what this ungrateful daughter, who never sends any money home, wants? When I asked about my father's condition, my mother sneered. He injured his back about a year ago and can't work anymore. Now he just stays at home and gets in my way. He's as useless as you are, Jane. Simon was taken aback by my mother's harsh words, but his attention quickly shifted when he saw my sister Kim. Wow, you're Jane's sister. You're stunning. I can hardly believe you two are related. Kim, who had grown more self-centered since starting college, now sported flashy clothes and a vibrant hair color that seemed inappropriate for her age. Despite being old enough to have graduated, she still seemed like a student, which reflected her lack of seriousness about her studies. This guy is your husband, Jane, Kim said, eyeing Simon with feigned sweetness. He's quite handsome and seems way too good for you. I almost feel sorry for him. Kim deliberately flirted with Simon, her touches and compliments clearly meant to show off. It pained me to see Simon so delighted by Kim's attention, but I resolved to stay focused on my plans. I was marrying Simon, and that was final. I'm going to cut ties with all of you, I declared. Well, if you're going to do that, could you at least wait until I've finished taking care of your father? My mother replied, barely looking up from her snacks. I need to look after him. But honestly, I don't want to. And I definitely don't want Kim to deal with it either. It's her college life, after all. It would be a shame to distract her with such a bothersome task. You should be responsible for taking care of your father, Jane. Both of you are incompetent, so you'll get along just fine. Her words infuriated me, but I knew I couldn't ignore my father's needs. From that day forward, I began visiting my parents' house frequently to care for him. As I took on this responsibility, I discovered that neither my mother nor Kim worked. Kim didn't have a part-time job, and my mother had been a stay-at-home since my father's collapse. Yet they frequently dined out and shopped extravagantly. To my shock, they had even taken my father's bankbook without his permission, spending his savings as if it were their own. My father was aware of their actions but chose to remain silent. "Dad, they'll keep doing this unless we do something about it. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "If I had, they would never admit they were wrong or apologize," he said. "I didn't want to burden you further." Despite everything, my father had always worked tirelessly for the family and was the only one who truly cared for me. I wanted to help him in any way I could. Just as I was contemplating how to address the situation, I received a call from the hospital where my father had been admitted after his collapse. I rushed to my parents' house before heading to the hospital. My mother and sister were lounging on the couch, absorbed in the TV, showing no sign of worry when the hospital called me. "Father collapsed, didn't he?" I asked, exasperated. "Oh, it's an exaggeration to say he collapsed," my mother replied dismissively. "He just fell in the hallway and hit his head. The ambulance took him to the hospital. I'll leave the rest to you." "But we need to go to the hospital. I'm worried about Father," I insisted. "Shut up," she snapped. "If he doesn't make it, the insurance will cover it. Why are you getting so emotional?" My mother's coldness and her indifference made me sick. I left them behind and rushed to the hospital. At the hospital, I found my father lying in bed, hooked up to various tubes and barely conscious. As his condition worsened, he managed to notice me and murmured faintly, "I'm sorry for being so sudden. I must be being punished. I wasn't a good father because I couldn't protect you from our family." With those final words, my father closed his eyes. "I don't care about that, Dad. I love you. Please get well soon," I pleaded, holding his hand tightly, but he never responded. A week later, a lawyer contacted me regarding my father's will. He informed me that I was named as the beneficiary of an inheritance. According to the will, I was to inherit $3 million. I was stunned. It turned out that my father had hidden another bank book separate from the one my mother had taken, which held the $3 million. He had also left a note specifying that this information should not be shared with any other family members. It seemed that this was his way of ensuring my future even after he was gone. Overwhelmed by my father's unexpected kindness, I made my way back to my parents' house to retrieve the hidden bank book. As I arrived, my mother and sister were waiting at the front door, their stances commanding and imperious. "What are you doing here now?" my mother demanded. "Came to scavenge things now that Dan's dead? How despicable. Everything here, the house, the car, belongs to me and Kim. Don't act like a thief." I knew better than to discuss my inheritance with them, especially given their unwillingness to listen. "I'm here to collect Father's memorabilia, and shouldn't I be entitled to at least a small share of the inheritance?" Without missing a beat, my mother produced a document and waved it in front of me. It was another will, supposedly written by my father, but the handwriting was unmistakably Kim's, not my father's distinctive script. The will claimed that my mother and sister would inherit all of my father's estate. "I can't make out much of this as Kim's handwriting is so poor," I said, struggling to understand the document. "That doesn't matter," my mother replied coldly. "This is the will, and it's already been shared with all our relatives and neighbors. It's too late for you to contest it now." My mother refused to let me enter the house, fully aware that I knew the will was a forgery. Defeated, I left and returned home. Simon was waiting for me, concern etched on his face. "Were you at your parents' house? If you told me, I would have gone with you. It's a shame I missed seeing Kim." I was taken aback. "Why are you so interested, and what does any of this have to do with you, Simon?" "I went to retrieve my father's inheritance, but my mother and sister kicked me out of the house." "How much did you all inherit from your father?" Simon asked me, curiosity piqued. "I'm not sure of the total amount, but the house, land, and everything else were in his name." "So it must be quite substantial," I replied. "I see," Simon said, pressing further. "And how much of the inheritance do you get, Jane?" I hesitated, knowing I shouldn't reveal the truth. My instincts told me there was no inheritance for me. Everything was going to be divided between my mother and sister. Simon's face darkened as he suddenly retrieved the divorce papers from his room and thrust them in front of me. "I knew it. I knew you wouldn't inherit anything. You're just a burden. And I've been talking to Kim a lot lately. Honestly, you're just in my way. I want a divorce now, since there's nothing in it for me if we stay together. Simon had already signed his portion of the divorce papers, so I signed them immediately. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction as I watched Simon leave with the papers, eager to file them at the city office. This was likely the last time I'd see him smile so broadly, and the same went for my mother and sister. It felt like justice was finally catching up with those who had tormented my father and me for years. Later that day, I consulted with the lawyer who had handled my father's will and asked him to accompany me to my parents' house. When I presented the real will to my mother and sister, their usual calm demeanor turned to shock and disbelief as they read the document over and over. "This is a lie," my mother protested. "I have a will here that states Kim and I are the sole heirs. If you claim the other will is a forgery," the lawyer said, "we can conduct a handwriting analysis. If it's proven to be a fake, you could be charged with fraud. Are you prepared to face that?" My mother was left speechless, unable to respond. I also learned a great deal from Dan. He revealed that even after his health declined, my mother and sister had abandoned him, sold all his possessions without permission, and acted as they pleased. Kim, on the other hand, had been indulging in reckless behavior, gambling and spending excessively from his personal bank account, leaving him deeply in debt. Due to these malicious actions, both of them were stripped of any inheritance rights. The lawyer made it clear that if my mother and sister continued to unjustly interfere with my inheritance, we would file a lawsuit against them. As the lawyer finished speaking, my mother and sister were left in a state of utter despair. I decided it was time to collect my father's hidden bank book and leave my parents' house for good. With that, I finally felt completely free from the burdens of my family. Soon after, Simon, unaware of the truth, apparently approached my sister, hoping to start a relationship with her. My mother and sister, keeping the inheritance issue a secret, married him quickly. Their aim was to secure a steady source of income and make him their personal ATM. Simon, deceived and eager to enjoy his newfound wealth, bought several luxury cars and quit his job, relying on what he thought was their inheritance. Eventually, Simon noticed something was off and reached out to me in a panic. "Jane, I was wrong. You're all I have. I want to start over." I replied simply, "I don't need you anymore. Besides, you have Kim now. You should take care of your wife properly," and gently ended the call. Moments before Simon called, I have received a call from Kim. "You've ruined my life. Simon quit his job and splurged like a fool as soon as we got married. I can't believe a man who only cares about money is now my husband. My family name is tarnished because of him. What are you going to do about it?" I responded calmly, "Kim, you're just as interested in money as Simon is. You two are a perfect match. Besides, I heard you and Simon were getting along well while we were still married. Be happy your love came true. I'll be filing a claim for compensation for the affair, though. From now on, let's only communicate through our lawyers. I never want to hear from you again." "Hey, I'm your sister. Aren't you going to treat me like family?" Kim protested. I laughed at her words. "You're the one who never treated me like family." With that, I hung up, blocked her number, and never heard from her again. I was finally free. I used my father's inheritance to build a new house and settled into it. I found a fulfilling job as an office clerk and embraced a busy but satisfying life on my own. Occasionally, I felt a pang of loneliness, but I knew my father was watching over me. As I looked at his picture on my wall, I felt his gentle smile and knew he was proud.